I'm not gonna lie, the last month or so hasn't been so great for me. Not here on the channel, don't get me wrong. Things are humming right along, despite my insistence on reviewing releases that no one cares about, or ever cared about for that matter, and I definitely appreciate each and every one of you that stops by for a watch regardless. But you see, without getting into too much detail, I've had some, we'll say automobile-related issues recently that are probably going to involve Flo from Progressive coming to my house with a baseball bat. And I know, in the grand scheme of things, insurance takes care of it, everyone's healthy, things are going to be okay, but it does get to be a bit disheartening and even depressing. Times like this is when someone needs a hero, someone that they can look up to as a beacon of good, someone that's inspiring even when things seem to be crashing down around you. So I thought, what better time to have some superhero action on the channel? And wouldn't you know it, as I was looking over at the shelves to pick out this week's review, it stood out like a ray of sunshine with its very yellow cover, and that's Superman for the Genesis. And you know, it didn't hurt that there's a major motion picture in theaters right now starring the last son of Krypton either. That may or may not have been the inspiration for this week's review before all of the automotive related nonsense came up. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that, there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because you don't live in the United States and you don't know who Flo is. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, if you pay attention to the Hollywood gossip rags, Flo's assistants probably wish they had Kal-El on speed dial. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Okay, insurance jokes aside, I'll be honest, I am not a Superman guy. Granted, part of that is because I'm also not a DC guy, so I didn't grow up reading his comic books. But also, at least to me, the character just never grabbed me. Superman as presented just seemed far too powerful, too godlike. So it was hard for me to develop any interest in a character that could basically do anything. So where's the risk? Where's the danger? Because of that, I never saw 2006's Superman Returns or 2013's Man of Steel. I also have never seen Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, but I'm pretty sure I'm not missing anything there. Previously, I've covered two DC-related games from Sunsoft on the channel. Batman, based on the film of the same name from 1989 in episode 149, and then the non-film related Batman Revenge of the Joker in episode 249. While I don't think Revenge of the Joker is as good as the original title, you have to consider that part of that is because the original Batman is one of my favorite games on the console, so it had a lot to live up to, and Revenge of the Joker on its own is still a strong effort. But what about Sunsoft's take on Superman? Can it live up to the standards of those Batman titles? Can it do something that really only Richard Pryor was able to do previously and make me care about Superman? Well, I like it so much that I decided to watch all 216 episodes of Smallville. Or is Superman the game a relatively boring effort that won't change any of my opinions about the character and that didn't see release in Japan for a reason? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And here's my copy of Superman for the Genesis. This copy is in really nice condition. No markings to the outer cover, the hang tab is intact at the top of the case, and there's no sun bleaching, water damage, or edge wear to the inner cover, which is all a nice change of pace from my paint last week, which had numerous issues. I've had this one for a long time. I don't really remember when I picked it up, but I'm guessing it was at one of the disc replays around here. It's definitely not what you would call a common title, but it's not rare either. I definitely see it more often than either of the Sunsoft Batman titles, or the later Death and Return of Superman. Possibly due to that, and possibly due to other reasons, Superman is also not as expensive as those other three titles, currently only averaging about $50 for a complete copy. As far as the front cover art goes, I like it a lot.
This is definitely a very eye-catching cover, and not just because of the bright yellow background that wraps around the entire cover. This was from the period in time when Sega let third parties design their own covers and not have to apply specific formatting, which allowed the third parties to do these covers where the artwork took up the entire cover, which is always my preference. I get Sega wanting to have a uniform design to all the games so that people would just immediately know that something was a Sega title, but to me, most of the time that's just wasted space that could go to art or logos. And in this case, Sunsoft used all of it, with good old Clark bursting through straight from the comics with the proper Superman logo down at the bottom. Somewhat surprisingly, especially since this is a Sunsoft title, Superman was not released in Japan. I'm not really sure why that was, unless there was some sort of bizarre licensing issue, but regardless, due to that, there's no Japanese version to compare it to. Instead, the only alternate cover is from the European version, which also adds the Man of Steel as a subtitle. I've got to be honest, I hate that cover. Changing the background to black is boring, and then along with that, Superman just looks like a villain the way that his face is blacked out due to the shading. Just a really odd artistic choice there. Flipping over the back, and, well, I've got mixed feelings here. Even though this is a North American release, the rear cover actually resembles more of what I would expect to see on a Japanese rear cover, with no flavor text trying to sell the game, and instead additional artwork of Brainiac and then 2 decent quality, but oddly cropped screenshots down below. I don't hate it, but it also seems somewhat low effort, and the screenshots being cropped and not showing the bottom of the screen is just very strange. Granted, I'm not sure that you really needed to do much to sell a Superman game, as comic book fans probably would just buy it regardless, but this is just an odd thing to see, especially releasing in Christmas of 1992, and this looks way more like an early third-party release. In this case, it's actually the opposite of what happened with the European release, with the European rear cover doing the better job and dumping the Brainiac artwork and instead going with 4 uncropped screenshots and then flavor text. Opening up the case, and we've got the manual in decent shape, but like the rear cover, it's somewhat minimalistic. Superman isn't a very complicated game, so I'm not expecting a whole lot here, but I do have one specific complaint. The game consists of 5 rounds, but only the first 3 have descriptions. Now, if they'd put in a note about you'll have to experience round 4 and round 5 for yourself or something like that, I'd understand, but the way that it's written, it's almost like they wrote the manual before those last 2 levels were completed, so they just left it out. Now, finally, this isn't a criticism necessarily, but the way the manual is presented, like how everything is formatted, it's just so antiquated, just like the rear cover. It's almost like this was supposed to have originally been released in 1990, but was shelved. Okay, that's the package. Let's see if the game's action is fresh, or if it's as stale as the packaging. I'm going to be very upfront about things here. In my time playing Superman this week, I never got past the 2nd level. However, it wasn't for a lack of trying, and I did play the game for my usual 5-hour minimum. There's plenty of footage on my computer of me playing and then almost immediately quitting the first level because it wasn't worth my time to continue, as it was better for me just to start over from the beginning and try again. Now, I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but I just wanted to explain in advance why during this section of the review, you're only seeing gameplay footage from the first 2 levels. To be fair to me, as mentioned in the last section, the game only has 5 levels total, so you are seeing about 40% of the game here. And between that and the time that I actually put into playing it, I think that's enough to review. I've certainly played less of a game and reviewed it, for instance, when Shakan came up for review back in episode 174. But that's not exactly putting Superman in good company, and for good reason. Somehow Shakan got 2 stars out of me in that review, but my lasting memory of the game from 3 years ago was that it was just brutally hard, in a way that caused me not just to not want to try to practice and get good at it, but to also never want to try playing it again, due to just how eminently frustrating it was to play. And while I wouldn't necessarily say that Superman is as frustrating, or at least in the same way that Shakan was, it's still pretty freaking frustrating. And you might be wondering, Well, I mean, Sunsoft had such a good track record with the DC titles. You were talking earlier about how good Batman and Batman Revenge of the Joker are. How could they have screwed up Superman so badly? Unfortunately, I've got a few reasons, but by far the biggest issue with the game is its controls. So let's get into that. Superman, for the most part, is a platformer. Now, there are a few vertical and horizontal shooter levels as well, and as a rule, anytime a game is trying to mix two completely different genres of video games together, you would do well to have your defenses raised. But honestly, I only have marginal complaints about the shooting sections, mainly because I only got to the one that's the second part of level 1, so I can't really speak to any of the later ones. But that section in particular was fine, especially once you had played it a few times and figured out how to best get through it with only taking minimal damage, much like other real shooters. Due to that, most of my complaints about the controls are in regard to those platforming sections, and they fall into two categories: the options that you're given as a player in regards to the controls, and then how those controls are actually implemented. The first part there, the options that you're given, is partially philosophical. Now, keep in mind, the main character in the game and who you're playing as is a guy that I described in the intro as being too powerful. Now, of course, having a character that's as powerful as Superman is could potentially be problematic from a game design perspective. Like, how do you make a video game starring Superman not be an absolute cakewalk, just due to how powerful Superman is presented as being in the comic, and the movies and such? Well, one way in which you do that, if you're Sunsoft, is you severely limit Superman's powers. This was always to be expected, because usually for a game to be interesting, you need to not be playing with the powers of a god. I mean, unless you're screwing around in Doom on Nightmare Mode or something like that. You know, there has to be a sense of danger, which leads to a sense of accomplishment when you figure out how to get through a level or defeat a boss. The problem here, though, is that it seems like Superman has been neutered a bit too much, and the powers that you're left with are odd choices. Specifically, here what I'm talking about is the use of special powers, which are mapped to the A button. By default, Superman has an extra strong punch, which completely makes sense. I could totally see having Superman be able to uncork a heavy haymaker when fighting enemies. About my only complaint there is, one swing of the fist, and then you have to wait for about 10 seconds for your power meter to refill and then swing again. So, Lord help you if you miss your target. Now, I don't mind having to wait for a power meter to recharge, that totally makes sense. But 10 seconds is a bit much. Then there's Superman's laser vision, which can only be used in flying levels apparently. Now, to me, that's a huge miss. Like the punches, I totally understand not wanting to just allow Superman to be able to constantly shoot laser beams, but the way Superman's combat is designed, he has a huge disadvantage when it comes to ranged attacks, and allowing him to be able to occasionally use his laser beam powers would go a long way to fixing some of the issues with the platforming levels. Superman's final special power is being able to drill holes. Yes, you heard that right. Sunsoft thought it made sense that Superman needed to be able to alternate his extra strong punch with a spinning maneuver that allows him to drop through the floor to the next portion of the level. I just don't know what to do with that. Did the developers happen to read one Superman comic where he does this and thought it would be a good addition to the game? Why wouldn't he just punch or fly through the floor? And of course, to make this even more silly, Superman can only do this at specific predetermined points of the level, which are shown with a sign that basically reads, "Do your special move here." If this was the 8-bit era and game designers hadn't quite figured out what worked in video games yet, I'd understand. But keep in mind, this game came out in almost 1993. They knew better. Hell, Sunsoft proved that with Batman, which originally came out over 2 years before Superman. However, I mentioned my issues with the controls were twofold. It wasn't just that they made some curious decisions about what Superman could or couldn't do. It was that once you decided what you were going to do within those constraints, getting Superman to actually do what you wanted him to do is problematic at best. And this is the real heart of the frustration with the game. I've said it multiple times on the channel, you can have a game that looks fantastic and sounds great, but if it plays terribly, then it's a loss, and that is at very least the direction Superman is going in. Aside from that power punch I mentioned, Superman also has a standard punch with the B button. You would think that this would be Superman's primary offense, especially since Superman is pretty well known for punching things. Well, you'd be wrong. I mean, it probably should be his primary offense, but with the aforementioned range issues, punching isn't helpful most of the time, and when it is called for, it has a strange delay, which, for moving targets, requires you to time the punches just right, or else you'll miss and then not be able to get off another punch before you are the one taking a hit. I don't know how Sunsoft screwed up something so basic as punching, but they did. The only other game that I've reviewed so far that had a similar issue was The Curse of Ilmore Bay back in episode 115, and in that game it seemed like the delay was due to extra frames of animation. So maybe that's the same issue here, but regardless, you're going to want to avoid punching except in specific scenarios. At this point, you're probably wondering, well, if the special powers are limited and punching sucks, how does Superman attack enemies? Well, you see, that ends up being a function of the jump button. Superman will punch upwards when jumping, and then stomp with his foot when coming down. And this actually works decently, and isn't a bad alternative to punching, even if it feels a bit weird at first, because it's more the repertoire of a certain Italian plumber. And this is bared out by the fact that Superman isn't very good at this. Both jumps and stomps need to be hit precisely, or else Superman will end up taking damage. And it seems like that certain enemies can't be attacked like this at all. So if you attack the wrong enemy like this, Superman will just end up taking damage regardless. It all ends up just being so annoying. Due to the limited amount of health power-ups located in the levels, the goal ends up being just to conserve health and not take any damage if you can avoid it. And of course, there's going to be times when you just end up taking damage regardless due to the poor controls. Also, it doesn't always seem like the damage is consistent. In the first level, I remember a run where I took a hit from one of the guys that just runs at you at the beginning of the level, and took seemingly no damage. But then later on in that same level, another one of those guys hit me, and I lost 4 bars. I believe the phrase that the kids use is, "make it make sense." I mentioned that I had a few issues with Superman, and the second issue goes hand in hand with the first, but it also needs a lot less time to explain. Simply put, the game is too hard, and not only is the game too hard, but the game has no options to configure. When you start a game, that's it. You're starting straight at round 1, and you don't get a choice of difficulty level or lives. Hell, you don't even get an option to adjust your controls or a sound test. And in what should be a common refrain with this game, remember that this is almost 1993 that we're talking about. This wasn't a 1990 release when they hadn't quite figured out Genesis games yet. But man, with things like this, it feels like it. There's just too many things going on in the levels to expect you to get through without taking damage, and the designers really would have helped their case to have toned things down a bit. As is, I was eventually able to memorize the first half of the second levels to where I could get through them, but even then, as you can probably tell from the game capture, to do that still required taking a very slow and cautious approach to the levels. And maybe some people like having to strategize a lot in their platformers, but to me, having to be that cautious definitely kills some of the fun and spontaneity that I would expect in an action game. Eventually, I was able to make it to the second part of that second level, which has you in a subway train trying to avoid all sorts of robots, mutant spiders, and Mr. Mixelpick throwing bombs at you. And of course, the jump attacks don't work anymore because you're in an enclosed space and can't jump up so high. And I had just had it at that point. In my mind, it was very much along the lines of, okay, I spent hours learning all the weird caveats of how to control the game, and now you want to change the rules on me? This is where I just had to put the controller down. From a graphics perspective, Superman doesn't exactly look very super. And again, I've got to go back to the fact that this was a Christmas season 1992 release. It doesn't look bad, mind you, but the relatively small sprites used in the majority of the game give things an 8-bit feel, albeit with a 16-bit coat of paint. There's just nothing that wows me here, and if I'm being honest, both Batman and Batman Revenge of the Joker are both substantially more impressive from a graphics perspective. I don't want to hammer the game too hard on the graphics because I don't think they're specifically bad, and there's nice little details like the animations for Superman's cape waving. There's just not anything that really wows me here. On the other hand, the game's soundtrack is excellent and might be its best feature. I'm actually going to give the soundtrack the highest compliment that I can give it, and that's that the background music sounds very Yuzo Koshiro-esque in both composition and tone. Unfortunately, it's not enough to make me forget that I'm playing Superman and not Streets of Rage, but I do appreciate it, and it's nice to see that Sunsoft at least got one thing correct in this release. The sound effects aren't quite as impressive as the music, simply because there's not a whole lot of them, but what is there is of good quality and matches the on-screen action well. As mentioned, I'm not a DC guy, and I'm especially not a Superman guy. What that means is, while I know some members of Batman's Rogues Gallery and some major DC heroes, like the members of the Justice League or Teen Titans, once you get outside of that, I have very little frame of reference. My point here is that due to that fact, I don't really know who these characters are or what's going on. And because of that, the overall game really needed to be good to draw me in, and it just doesn't hit that mark. Now, there are nice touches, like the level intros being ripped from the Daily Planet, but other than that, there's no real explanation for what's going on or why. Apparently it all boils down to Brainiac masterminding some sort of attack on Superman, culminating with Brainiac kidnapping Lois Lane for Superman to have to rescue. But all of that is just kind of assumed. What would have helped out a lot would there have been to have some comic pages in between the levels that fleshed the story out, similar to what they did with Maximum Carnage. I assume that perhaps there was some language barriers that maybe prevented that level of story development, but keep in mind, this game wasn't even released in Japan, so they knew the audience was going to be primarily English speaking. All in all, Superman is a disappointment. It just is. There's no two ways around it. And as much as I tried to learn and deal with the game's shortcomings, it's simply not worth the frustration when there's so many other better options out there. It almost makes me wonder what went wrong here. Like, was it just rushed? Perhaps development on the game was running long and they had to make sure that they got it out in time for the Christmas season, and because of that, it wasn't tweaked and tuned like you would see in other titles? This would explain the bare-bones, no-option menu presentation and the issues I had with the controls. We'll probably never know, but as it stands, I can't give it more than 2 stars, and if you're not a fan of Superman or don't appreciate difficult games, you better knock that down to just 1. I wouldn't tell anyone specifically not to buy this, but just be careful.
And that's it for Superman on the Genesis. Superman is on that list of games that I have that I want to revisit when I either get an EverDrive or a Mega SG. Something where I can mess around with save states, because I would like to eventually see the entire game on my own without just resorting to watching a playthrough on YouTube. But I also know that time is a valuable thing, and I simply don't have enough to spread around on each and every game that comes through here. I mean, all those WRC and Assassin's Creed games aren't going to play themselves, If you've really got a Superman Jones and you haven't seen the recent James Gunn-led movie, I'd definitely recommend that instead. It's a much better use of 2 hours of your life, and even though I'm admittedly not a Superman fan, I really appreciated how they took a different approach to making a comic book movie than Marvel. Not better, I'm not saying that, just different. Next time on the channel, it's a game that, honestly, I don't remember putting in the schedule. Now, normally, if I have something penciled in ahead of time, it's because it's the sequel to something that I've already reviewed, or maybe a version of that game on another platform, like say recently with Mortal Kombat on the Sega CD. This, though, is not, and while there's technically a Genesis release with the same name, I haven't reviewed it yet, so I really don't know why or how it got in there. But hey, it's a game I know nothing about on a console that I haven't touched in a month and a half, so I suppose it's as good a time as any to go ahead and review it. Hopefully I will not have a gay old time, but when I researched it for the Genesis vs. Master System presentation earlier this year, I didn't exactly hear good things, so I guess we'll just have to see. That clue was a bit much, wasn't it? Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 293. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.